Not every poison is brewed in a kitchen. The most patient are stirred into a family, sweetened with a smile, and served across so many years the victim forgets to taste them. Verity Wren had swallowed her stepmother's cruelty for a decade. So when the woman folded her into a coach, bound for the most feared duke in the Fenlands, she expected one final humiliation and nothing more. Instead, she stood in his shadowed hall, saw death shining at the bottom of his cup, and heard her own voice ring out, "Don't drink it, your grace." And the duke's hand went still, one breath from his lips. The coach had not been built for comfort, and the road across the fen had never truly been built at all. It was a raised causeway of packed earth, a gray thread stitched between black water and a blacker sky, and every rut in it jolted up through the thin cushions into Verity Wren's bones. She sat very straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and watched the mist come rolling in off the marsh. She was 24 years old. She did not feel it. Somewhere in the last 10 years the girl she had been had quietly gone out, like a rushlight pinched between two fingers, and left behind a woman who knew the price of everything, and had unlearned the habit of hoping for anything. Her gown was gray wool, mended at the cuff, and turned twice at the hem, and her cloak was thinner than the weather deserved. The damp had found her shoulders an hour ago, and settled in to stay. Folded small and hard as a pebble in her reticule was the letter. Her stepmother had written it herself, in that looping and generous hand that fooled everyone who did not have to live beneath it. Lady Ottoline Wren wrote beautiful letters. She had penned this one at the breakfast table while Verity stood behind her chair, reading it aloud between spoonfuls of coddled egg, savoring each phrase as though it were a sweetmeat. The Duke of Blackmere, she had said, requires a woman skilled in the still-room, and who among us is more skilled than our dear, dutiful Verity? On the settee, her two daughters had pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. Cressida had laughed until she was thumped upon the back. Lavinia had not troubled to hide it at all. Verity was no fool. She understood exactly what she was being sent into. The Duke of Blackmere did not send to strangers for anything, and everyone from London to the fen edge knew it. He had come home from the wars to find himself sudden master of the house, after his elder brother died in a single terrible night the county still spoke of in lowered voices. Some said a fever had carried the old duke off. Some said something worse, and touched the iron of their gate latches as they said it. Whatever the truth, the new duke had shut the doors of Blackmere Hall and never truly opened them again. He turned earls away at his gate. He had, it was whispered, run 3 physicians off his land, and told the last that he would sooner trust the marsh water than another man's medicine. He was not seeking a still-room maid, he was seeking no living soul at all. Which was precisely the point. Ottoline had written to be rid of Verity in a manner the neighbors might mistake for charity. To simply cast her out would set the parish whispering, so instead she had found her a door certain to slam. Verity would arrive uninvited at the house of a man famed for refusing all callers. She would be sent away, frightened perhaps out of her wits, and she would come crawling home with the tale, and the whole county would agree that poor Lady Ottoline had done her Christian best by a deluded and ungrateful girl. By the next season, it would harden into fact, and no respectable house would take her afterward. She would live out her years exactly where her stepmother wanted her, unpaid and unthanked, until she grew too old to be sent anywhere ever again. Verity turned the letter once in her fingers and put it away. She had 7 shillings sewn into the lining of her cloak. Running required money she did not possess. Staying required only endurance, which she had learned to counterfeit better than any coin. She had outlasted Ottoline for 10 years. She could outlast one gray afternoon with a duke, be he mad or merely bitter. The mist thinned, and the ditches along the causeway showed themselves. Verity's eye moved across them before she had decided to look. Meadowsweet, gone to seed. A last bruise of purple where the loosestrife still held. And there, half drowned at the water's lip, the tall spotted stems and drooping white heads of hemlock. Enough of it to still every heart in the coach if a person knew the drawing of it. The whole difference between a medicine and a murder had only ever been a matter of how much. Her mother had taught her that in a still room that smelled of drying lavender and warm beeswax, in the good years before the fever took her, and the house passed to a woman who looked at a healer's daughter and saw only a servant who need not be paid. Verity could no longer summon her mother's face with any clearness, but she remembered the hands, and all they had known, which root soothed and which root stopped the breath, which berry a child might safely eat, and which would fold that child up by nightfall. How to tell by scent alone, when something sweet had been quietly meddled with. It was the only inheritance left to her, and Ottoline had never thought to take it, because she had never known it was worth the taking. The coach lurched and slowed. Verity wiped the fog from the glass with her sleeve. Blackmere Hall rose out of the marsh ahead of her, and it did not look like a house at all. It looked like something the fen itself had grown, in the dark, to keep a secret. The drive was long and untended. The gravel sunk in places to a mud that pulled at the wheels. Ancient willows leaned in from either hand, and the hall swelled larger and blacker with every turn until it filled the window. It was built of a stone so dark it seemed nearly green, streaked with damp and furred with ivy. Only one window high beneath the roofline showed the faint amber of a single candle. Someone kept a light in that house of no one. The coach halted, and the driver made no move to hand her down. Verity opened the door herself and stepped into a cold that went through the soles of her boots, and before she had gone 3 paces the coach was already turning, desperate to be gone before the last light failed. She watched it go without surprise, having paid her fare with no way left home. Then she was alone in the mist, at the foot of a great flight of worn steps, the marsh at her back, and the dark house before her. She climbed. The knocker was a heavy ring held in the jaws of some beast, too weathered to name. Verity let it fall, and the sound went into the house and was swallowed whole. For a long while, nothing answered but the drip from the ivy. She had raised her hand to try again when the door drew inward. The man in the gap was old and very upright, dressed in worn but spotless black, with a face like a shuttered window. He did not look surprised to find her. He looked weary, as though strangers upon this step were a trouble he had prayed, was finished. His gaze traveled over her once. The soaked cloak, the muddied hem, the single small bag in her hand. "Whatever you are selling," he said, his voice dry as old paper, "His Grace is not buying, and whatever you have come to seek he does not give it. Go back to the village, while there is light." "I am not selling anything," Verity answered. "I am expected." Something shifted far back in the old man's eyes. "No one," he said slowly, "is expected. Here." Verity drew the letter from within her cloak and held it out. The crimson seal turned toward him. "I was sent by Lady Ottoline Wren to serve in his Grace's still-room. If I am not expected, then I have been lied to, which will surprise nobody who has met my stepmother. But I have traveled a very long way to be refused this doorstep, and I have run clean out of the strength to be refused it politely. You may carry the letter to your master, or you may leave me here until I become part of the masonry. I am told I am remarkably hard to shift." The butler regarded her a long moment. Then the shutter of his face opened by a hair, and what showed behind it was not irritation. It was something nearer to pity. He did not take the letter. The last one they sent, he said quietly, lasted 9 days. She went out over the causeway on foot in the dead of night, and would never afterward say why. He stepped back from the door. Whatever you have been told of this house, you were told it wrongly. Come in, out of the cold. His Grace will wish to see this letter himself. End quote. Verity crossed the threshold, and the door swung shut behind her with a weight she felt in her teeth. The hall was vast and cold, and smelled of wood smoke and wet stone, and beneath both something faintly, unpleasantly medicinal. As her eyes learned the dark, a young maid-servant came hurrying down the broad stair with a covered tray, silver catching what little light there was, and turned along a passage toward a thin line of gold beneath a distant door. The butler watched the tray go, and Verity saw the smallest tightening at the corner of his mouth. His Grace takes his cordial before the light fails, he said half to himself. Come, he does not care to be kept waiting. He turned toward that far door, and Verity followed him into the shadow, and something she could not yet name began to prickle along the nape of her neck. The passage ran deep into the house, past shrouded furniture, and one long portrait turned to face the wall, and ended at a door of dark oak, already standing ajar. Warm light spilled through the gap, and with it came wood smoke and old leather, and threaded faint beneath them, that same medicinal sweetness she had caught in the hall. Mr. Combe rapped once, and did not wait. The woman come from Lady Adeline Wren, your Grace, he said, and stood aside. Verity stepped in. It had been a fine library once. The walls were shelved to the high ceiling, though half the shelves stood empty now, their contents boxed or carried off, and the room had the stripped and watchful feeling of a place being slowly packed away, as though its master expected either to leave it or to be carried from it before long. A low fire burned in a hearth of black marble. Rain had begun somewhere in the last hour, and it ticked against the tall windows like fingernails on glass. A man sat at a broad desk with his back half to the fire. He did not rise, and he did not turn at once, which gave Verity a moment to take the measure of him. He was younger than the county's whispers had made him, no more than 35, and yet something had passed through him and left its mark upon everything. He was tall even seated, and broad across the shoulder, but there was a gauntness to him that fine linen could not hide the look of a strong man worn thin from somewhere inside. His hair was dark, and above his left temple ran a single startling streak of white, as though the color there had been frightened out of him in one night and had never come back. When at last he raised his head, his eyes were the flat gray of pewter, and they were the most watchful eyes she had ever stood beneath. They did not travel over her the way a man's eyes usually traveled over a woman. They simply fixed, and weighed, and returned nothing. So, said the Duke of Blackmere. His voice was low and dry and without any warmth in it whatsoever. Adeline Wren has sent me a girl, a woman, your Grace, Verity answered. The girl was left behind some years ago. One dark brow rose the smallest degree. On the desk before him lay her stepmother's letter, its crimson seal already broken. He tapped it once with a long finger. She writes that you are a healer, he said, that you possess a rare gift with the still room, and that she parts with you only out of Christian concern for my health, which she has heard is poor. He let the letter fall. It is a very generous letter. In my experience, generosity from a stranger is the most dependable warning that a thing is about to cost me dearly. So tell me plainly, whom did you injure, that your family is this eager to be rid of you? No one yet, said Verity. The day is young. For a moment, nothing at all happened. Then the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite into a smile. More the memory of where one had once lived. "It is a novelty," he said, "to be answered honestly under this roof. Do not let it become a habit. Honesty is expensive here, and I cannot yet say who is paying for it." A soft knock came at the door, and the young maid-servant from the hall slipped in with the covered tray. She was perhaps 16, thin and quick, with reddened hands, and she would not lift her eyes to the Duke. She set the tray upon the corner of the desk, drew off the cover, and there, beneath it, stood a tall glass of something pale gold, a thin curl of steam rising from its surface. A cordial of elderflower and honey warmed against the damp of the evening. The girl bobbed and turned to go. "Wait," said Verity. She had not meant to speak. The word was torn out of her before thought could stop it, dragged up by a scent that had reached her across the width of the desk and set every nerve her mother had ever trained to singing. Beneath the elderflower, beneath the honey, sat something else, a thin bitterness, an almondy sharpness that belonged in no cordial ever brewed for pleasure. She had met that smell exactly once before, in a stoppered bottle her mother had kept upon the highest shelf and had never once permitted her to touch, and had spoken of only in a low voice, the way one speaks of a thing that has killed before and will again. The Duke's hand had already closed around the glass. He was lifting it toward his mouth. "Don't drink it, Your Grace." The words rang out flat and hard across the library, and everything in the room came to a halt. The maid froze in the doorway. Coombe, half turned to leave, went still as stone, and the Duke, the glass a bare inch from his lips, did not drink. He did not startle, and he did not demand her meaning. He simply held there, unnaturally motionless, his pewter eyes rising to meet hers across the rim of the glass, and in them she saw not surprise, but a terrible arrested attention. The look of a man who has been waiting a long while for a blow and has just now heard it coming through the air. In the silence, Verity heard the full weight of what she had done settle over her. She had raised her voice unbidden in a great man's house against the very thing he had lifted to his mouth. If she was wrong, she was mad, and would be turned onto the causeway before the hour was out. If she was right, she was the stranger who had known on sight precisely how a duke was meant to die. "Explain," he said, very quietly. Verity came to the desk. She did not touch the glass. She bent to it and drew a slow breath through her nose, and the sweetness of almond rose to meet her, unmistakable now, and her stomach rolled over. "There is laurel in it," she said. "The water drawn off the leaves. You may smell it beneath the honey, if you have been taught the smell. No wholesome cordial has ever carried it, and no honest kitchen keeps the makings of it." She straightened and looked at him without flinching. "Had you drunk that to the bottom, Your Grace, I do not believe you would have lived to see the morning, and whoever said it before you knew that, as surely as I do." The silence that came after was total. The Duke set the glass down upon the desk with enormous care, as though it were a thing that might go off in his hand. He regarded it a long moment. Then he lifted his gaze to the maid. "Nell," he said, "who prepared this?" The girl had gone the color of tallow. "Mrs. Fenwick." "Your Grace," she whispered. "In the kitchen, the same as every night. I only carried it up. I swear on my mother, I only carried it." "Then go," he said, gently enough, and the girl was gone, her feet quick and light down the passage. Coombe. His voice had changed now, gone cold and level as the fen itself. "No one touches that glass. And not one word of this passes beyond these walls. Do you understand me?" The old butler's face was ashen. "Perfectly, Your Grace," he said, and withdrew, and drew the door shut behind him. And so they were alone, the Duke of Blackmere and the woman his enemy had sent him, with a glass of poison cooling on the desk between them. He rose at last, slowly, one hand flat upon the wood, and Verity saw both the effort it cost him and the care he took to bury it. Upright, he was taller than she had guessed, and the low fire threw his shadow up the emptied shelves like something vast. He came around the desk and stopped an arm's length from her, and now those pewter eyes went over her in earnest. Not as a man studies a woman, but as a man studies a lock he intends to pick. "You came to my door not 1 hour past," he said softly. "A stranger, sent by a woman I have never met, carrying a letter that lied about the reason for your coming. And within that same hour, you have looked at a glass I have taken every evening for a month, and told me it would end me." He tilted his head a fraction, and the firelight ran along the white streak at his temple. "You will forgive me, Miss Wren, if I cannot yet decide whether you are the greatest stroke of fortune in my life, or the final move in a game I did not know I was losing. So tell me, which of the two am I to believe?" Verity did not look away. She had spent 10 years learning to stand still beneath the eyes of people who wished her nothing but ill, and a duke's suspicion was only one more gaze to outlast. "Believe your own nose, your grace," she said. "You need not take a single word from me. Pour a little of it into a saucer, and set it out, and see what will and will not touch it by morning. Or send the glass to any apothecary in the county who is not already in the pay of whoever filled it. I have no means to make you trust me, and I should think the less of you if I had. I am a stranger sent to your door by my enemy on the very night you were meant to die. Were our places exchanged, I would suspect me also." He held her eyes a while longer. Then, unexpectedly, he sat, though not at the desk. He lowered himself into a worn, wing-backed chair beside the fire, and with 2 fingers he gestured her toward the one that faced it, the way a man lays down a card. "Sit," he said. "If you mean to unravel my murder in my own library, you may as well do it off your feet." Verity sat. The heat of the fire reached her at once, and she understood only then how cold she had been for so many hours, that the cold had come to feel like her own skin. She kept her back straight, and her hands folded, and waited. For a month, the Duke said at last, staring into the coals. "I have been unwell, a heaviness in the limbs. Headaches that put me in the dark for a day at a time, so that I cannot bear a candle or a voice. A slow going out, like a lamp starved of oil. I laid it at the door of the same weakness that has dogged me since the winter my brother died. My physician, a careful man named Merrick, called it a return of the old complaint and counseled rest and quiet and a strengthening cordial taken warm each night." He was silent a moment. "A strengthening cordial," he said again, and something dreadful moved behind his eyes. "Then it has been weeks," Verity said quietly, "a very little at a time. Never enough to fell you at a stroke, only enough to wear you down, and to wear the look of an illness while it did the work." She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over a column of her stepmother's household figures, and it came out level and ugly and exact. "Whoever this is, your grace, is not in any hurry, and that is the worst of it. Haste is careless. It leaves a bottle where it ought not to be, and a servant who saw too much. Patience leaves nothing, and is very hard to catch. My brother," said the Duke, "took a whole winter to die." He did not raise his voice, but the words seemed to cost him as much as the rising had Edmund. He faded across 4 months, and the physicians could put no name to it, and I sat at his bedside and watched it take him by inches. and when he was gone, it came for me in its turn, and I lived, though I have never been quite whole since." He looked at her at last. 3 years, Miss Wren. I have believed myself merely cursed with a brother's weak blood. You have shown me, in the space of a single hour, that I am not ill at all. I am being killed, slowly, and I have carried the doing of it upstairs to my own bed every night this month, warm, in a glass, and thanked the girl who brought it. Verity said nothing, for there was nothing to say that would not have been an insult, she thought, instead of the butler's words upon the step. The last one they sent lasted 9 days. There was a woman, she said carefully. Coombe spoke of one who kept your still-room, and went out over the causeway on foot in the night. What became of her? The Duke's jaw tightened. She grew frightened, he said. She would not say of what. She left in the dark, and sent for her box a week later from 3 counties off, and would not set foot on my land to fetch it. He met Verity's eyes and understood her at the same moment she understood herself. She was the last person in this house, Verity said slowly, with a trained nose, and she was frightened out of it. After she fled, there was no one left who could have smelled the almond under the honey. The still-room was left to rot, on purpose, your grace. Not from neglect, to blind the house. The Duke drew a long breath, and when he spoke again his voice had hardened into something practical, which she would come to know as his way of surviving. "Whatever else you are," he said, "you are not the one who began this. It was well under way before your coach ever crossed the causeway, and you are the one creature under this roof who saw it when a household of people I have fed and housed for years did not or would not. That makes you either the most useful person at Blackmere or the most dangerous, and I have decided I would sooner have both under my own eye than let either walk back down that road." He named his terms then as plainly as a man buying a horse. She would stay, not as a still-room maid got up for show, but as the one who prepared and tasted and stood guard over everything that passed his lips, and who would help him hunt the hand behind the glass. £30 the quarter. A dry room beside the still-room, the freedom of the house. And of any locked cupboard in it she cared to open, his own included. And in return, the whole of her art turned upon the single question of keeping him alive long enough to learn who wished him dead. "You should know," he added, "that it makes a target of you in your own right. Whoever this is will not love the woman who spoiled a month of his work. And it cuts your last thread to Lady Ottoline clean through. There is no going back to her after tonight. There was never anything to go back to," Verity said. "You are offering me a dry room, honest work, and £30 I have never in my life been paid, and an enemy who at least has the courtesy to want me dead for something I have done, rather than merely for taking up space at a table." She very nearly smiled. "You will have to try a good deal harder than poison, your grace, to make that sound to me like a poor bargain." Something eased, very slightly, in the hard line of his shoulders. "And your stepmother?" "She meant you flung from my door, and ruined by the telling of it, up and down the county. Instead, she has handed me the one person who may keep me breathing." He reached for paper and drew the inkstand toward him. "I shall write to her tonight, and thank her most warmly for her generous and Christian gift. I shall tell her that Miss Wren suits me entirely, and will remain at Blackmere as long as I have need of her." He dipped the pen. "I shall leave the nature of that need to her imagination, which I suspect a livelier and filthier thing than mine." But even as he wrote, a colder thought moved through Verity, unspoken. Ottoline had chosen this night, of all nights, to send her. It might be the ordinary cruelty of chance. or she had been sent to arrive exactly when a dead duke would need a stranger found standing over him, the empty glass in her hand. She folded the thought away with the others to be taken out later. In the light, the pen stopped. Coombe had returned, silent in the doorway, and his face told them both that the night was not yet finished with them. "Your Grace," the old man said, "the girl Nell is not in her room. Her box is gone from beneath the bed, and the side door stands unbarred to the marsh." He swallowed, and Mrs. Bez. "Fenwick swears upon everything she holds holy that the cordial left her kitchen clean, as it does every night, and was carried up untouched." Which meant, Verity thought, that whatever had gone into the glass had gone in somewhere between the kitchen and this room, in the dark of the passage. In the few short minutes it had traveled through the house in one frightened girl's 2 hands, and that girl was now running across a black marsh in the dead of night toward someone or away from something. Either way, she was the first thread already slipping through their fingers. Verity did not sleep so much as lie still and wait for the light, listening to the marsh breathe against the walls. When gray dawn came at last through the small window of the room they had given her, she found she had passed the night with her mother's knowledge running through her hands like the beads of a rosary, sorting what she knew of laurel and its water, of doses and their slow arithmetic. Of the quiet ways a patient hand might turn a strengthening tonic into a grave. The room was small and plain and smelled of dried herbs, for it lay hard beside the old still room, and someone, Coombe most likely, had thought to have a fire lit in it against the marsh damp. She lay a while under the weight of clean wool blankets and named the feeling that would not let her rest. It was not fear. Fear she knew as well as the lines of her own palms. This was stranger. For the first time in 10 years, someone in the house needed her to be exactly what she was, and had asked it of her, and meant to pay her for it. She had lain down in a house that wished her gone, and woken in one that wished her awake, and the difference sat behind her ribs, warm and unfamiliar, too new to be comfortable and far too welcome to put out. She rose, and dressed in her same gray gown, and went to see what she had inherited. The still room of Blackmere had been a good one once. It ran long and low behind the kitchens, its walls lined with shelves of stoppered bottles and dusty jars, its great scarred table gone pale with years of scrubbing, time. But it wore the neglected look of a place no careful hand had kept for years. The herbs on their hooks gone to gray dust, the bottles unlabeled or mislabeled, a fine gray film over everything. Whoever had tended it last had either fled or died, and Verity thought she could now guess which and why. And yet, at the far end of the table where the window light fell, there was one clean place in all that gray dust. A small square, scrubbed bright and recent, where a mortar had lately stood, and beside it the faint ring of a bottle set down and lifted again. Someone had worked here, quietly, in a room everyone believed abandoned, and cleaned up after themselves in every part but one. She did not touch it. She marked it, and moved on, and her heart beat harder for it. A sound made her turn. In the corner, on a heap of old sacking near the cold hearth, lay an enormous gray deerhound, ancient and half-blind, its muzzle gone white with years. It lifted its great head and regarded her out of clouded eyes, and it did not growl, and it did not rise. It merely watched. "That is Barrow," said the Duke from the doorway. She had not heard him come. "He is older than my sins and twice as useless, and he trusts almost no one, so you may take his indifference as a warm welcome indeed." He came slowly into the room, and by the gray morning light she could see the toll the night had taken of him. The deeper hollows beneath his eyes, the deliberate care with which he set each foot. "He will not eat from the kitchen any longer," the Duke went on more quietly, his gaze on the old dog. "Not for a fortnight now. He turns his head from the good meat Fenwick sends down and goes hungry rather than touch it. I called him a foolish old beast for it." He was silent a moment. "He is not, I begin to think, a foolish old beast at all." Verity looked at the hound with a new respect. "Dogs," she said, "will smell what we have trained ourselves not to notice. He has been telling you the truth for a fortnight, Your Grace, in the only language he has. We were merely slower than the dog." She set to work, and the Duke, rather than leave her to it, drew up a stool and stayed, and watched her hands the way he watched everything in his house, as though he had learned the hard way that a thing unwatched was a thing that turned on you. She began with the glass, carried up sealed under Coomb's own eye. She did not taste it, and let no drop of it near a cut or a broken nail, and said as much aloud so that he might learn caution by watching her keep it. What she did was look and smell and think. She set a very little in a white saucer, and watched how it dried and marked the faint rime it left behind. She smelled it warm and smelled it cold. And everything her senses gave up to her, laid beside everything her mother had left folded in her memory, told one and the same tale. Laurel water, and not a clumsy flood of it, but a measured and careful hand. Someone who knew to a nicety how much would pass for a strengthening tonic, and how much would leave a corpse, and had chosen, patiently, all this month, the first. "That is the part that ought to frighten us most," she told him. "This is not rage. Rage upends the whole bottle and runs. This is patience, and real skill, and a very great deal of trouble taken to be mistaken for something kinder. Whoever brews this has studied their craft, and studied you, and studied this house until they knew its every habit." She looked up. "Your Grace, I must see the physician's cordials, the ones Dr. Merrick has left you. I should like to learn whether the poison rides in the drink itself, poured in on the way up, or in the very medicine that was meant to strengthen you against your illness." Something flickered across his face, swiftly mastered. "You suspect Merrick, I suspect the cupboard," Verity said. "I have not yet so much as met the man. But a physician who names poisoning an old complaint, and then prescribes a nightly cordial into which that poison is so conveniently poured, has either been very badly deceived, or is very useful to someone, and I should dearly like to know which. Both," she added, "are worth the knowing before he calls again." They spent the whole of that grey morning at it, and Verity was aware, distantly, that she had never in her life worked so. Not worked for a person, watched and weighed and found wanting, but worked beside one. He fetched what she asked for without complaint, and answered her questions as exactly as she put them, and when she thought aloud he did not talk across her, but waited and listened, and once or twice offered a thing so shrewd she had to revise him upward in her mind. There was a quick and ruthless intelligence under all that stillness, a mind that had had nothing worthy to bite upon through 3 years of being quietly murdered. And he, for his part, watched a woman handle the tools of life and death, without vanity or fear, and something long shut in his face came by degrees unlatched. Neither of them named it. But it was there in the room, small and stubborn as a seedling in stone, and the old dog lay between their stools as though he had decided to guard it. She laid out for him, plainly, the shape of the thing as she had begun to build it. A month of small doses wearing the mild face of an illness, a brother dead, of the very same slow going out across a whole winter, 3 years gone. A trained still-room woman, frightened off the land, and the room she kept left deliberately to to rot, so that no keen nose remained in the house. A poison chosen above all for its patience. And now, this morning, one clean square, in a foot of dust, where someone had been working in secret, in a room the whole household believed dead. It was not a list of accidents. It was a design laid down with care over years, and they had walked into the middle of it. And at the center of the design, she said, "There is only ever the one cold question. Who stands to gain, your grace, when the Duke of Blackmere dies?" He rose and went to the grimed window and looked out across the reeds, and for a while he did not speak. Then he told her. The title and the whole of the estate, should he die without a son of his body, passed entire to his cousin, a man named Bramwell Vaughan, who had spent the better part of his life in expectation of it, and rather more than the whole of his own fortune in advance of it, and who lived now in genteel and resentful ruin at the far edge of the marsh, waiting as he had waited at Edmund's graveside 3 years before. For the last life standing between himself and Blackmere to be quietly put out. He has never troubled to hide what he wants, the Duke said, only how patiently he is willing to wait for it, and how pleasantly he can smile while he waits. He turned back from the window. "And there, Miss Wren, is precisely where you and I go wrong if we are careless. It would be very easy and very satisfying to fix upon Bramwell and look no further, and a clever man who wished me dead would count upon exactly that." He came back and stood over the ruined table, over the saucer and the sealed glass, and the small ordered evidence of her morning poison. "Is called the coward's weapon," he said, "and the woman's by wits who have never had it fed to them. But in my long acquaintance with it, it is chiefly the weapon of the trusted. Whoever did this was let in. Into my house, into my kitchen, into my confidence, and near enough to my supper to salt it, night after night, and be thanked. That is a short list, and a bitter one, and I no longer know which name upon it I dare to strike off first." He had not finished speaking when the sound came faint and far across the causeway, that neither of them had heard at Blackmere in a very long while, the steady carrying drum of a horse ridden hard toward the house. Barrow lifted his white muzzle from the sacking, and for the first time that morning began very low in his chest to growl. Kumi peered in the still-room doorway a moment later, a little short of breath, bearing a card upon a salver, as though it had been passed to him through the bars of a cage. "Your Grace," he said, "Mr. Bramwell Vaughan is come. He says he has heard that you are gravely unwell, and that he could not rest easy another day until he had seen for himself how you do." "Show him into the library," said the Duke, and rose. And Verity saw him put on his weakness the way another man might put on a coat, letting his shoulders round and his step drag, arranging his face into the grey exhaustion of the invalid the county believed him to be. "Say nothing of last night," he murmured to her as Coombe went. "Whatever you are my new still-room woman, and nothing more. Let us see what my cousin expects to find." Bramwell Vaughan came in on a gust of cold marsh air and a cloud of violet scent. He was near the Duke in age, but soft where the Duke was spare, a handsome man run slightly to seed, dressed a good deal finer than his means could honestly bear, in a bottle-green coat and a waistcoat stitched with silver thread. His smile arrived well before the rest of him, and never once reached his eyes, which were quick and pale and everywhere at once, counting the boxed shelves, the guttered fire, the thin frame of his cousin, the worth of every stick of it. "Gideon!" he cried, crossing the room with both hands outstretched. "My dear fellow, you look ghastly. I have not slept a wink since the word reached me." They are saying in the village that you are not long for this world, and I could not. I simply could not leave you to face it alone out here in this wretched fen, with none of your own blood about you." "That is very good of you," said the Duke, and let his cousin press his hands, and did not return the pressure. "As you see, I am not yet in my grave." "No," said Bramwell, and for the briefest instant something crossed his face that was not grief and not relief, but a swift, involuntary calculation, quickly buried under the smile again. "No, thank heaven, though you are much altered, cousin." Much. He turned at last to Verity, and his gaze went over her once, dismissed her gown, her plain face, her reddened hands, and could not account for her. "And who," he said, "is this?" "The Duke's new still-room keeper," Verity said before Gideon could answer, dropping the small curtsy of a servant and keeping her eyes lowered. "Sent to see to his Grace's cordials and his comfort, sir. A still-room keeper." Bramwell's pale eyes sharpened. "Cousin, a word with you, as family." He drew the Duke a little apart, though not so far that Verity, being furniture in his estimation, could not hear every word. "You cannot mean to trust your very medicine to some strange woman off the road. Where are her people? Who vouches for her? A man in your condition, wasting by the week, ought to be in the care of those who love him, not left to the physicking of a stranger." He lowered his voice into a show of tenderness. "Come to me at Fenwold. Let me nurse you. Let Dr. Merrick attend you properly, as he attended poor Edmund, and dismiss this creature back to wherever she was got." There it was. Verity kept her face empty, and her heart went cold and clear. He wished the Duke moved from his own house, away from the one nose that had caught the poison, and back under Merrick's hand. And he had named Merrick himself, unprompted, and named him warmly, and set the two deaths side by side in the same breath, as though they were the most natural pairing in the world. "I am comfortable where I am," said the Duke. "You are dying where you are," Bramwell snapped, and then caught himself and softened. "Forgive me, my distress runs away with me." He tried once more, and there was a thin whine of desperation under the charm now that had not been there before. The sound of a man who had counted upon a thing and found it not yet done. "At least let Merrick call this week. He can bring a fresh cordial, a stronger one. You look as though you need it." "I shall consider it," said the Duke. Bramwell had to be content with that. He stayed another quarter-hour praising the house. He plainly meant to gut and sell, mourning a cousin who was not yet dead. And all the while his eyes moved and counted and came back, again and again, to Verity, whom he could not place and did not like. Once, while the Duke was drawn aside by Coombe upon some small matter of the household, Bramwell crossed the room to where Verity stood by the shelves and looked down at her with the pale, prying eyes of a man appraising a horse he suspects of being lame. "You are a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice pitched carefully beneath his cousin's hearing. "A young woman with no people, alone in a dying man's house. That is a perilous place to be standing when he goes. Questions are asked. Blame must land somewhere." He smiled, the smile that went nowhere near his eyes. "Were I you, I should be a great many miles from here before that night comes. Go home to your family while the road is still open to you." Verity met his gaze and did not lower her own. "I have no family, sir," she said evenly, "and I have weathered worse men than you across a breakfast table." Something flickered behind his eyes, half irritation and half unease, and then the Duke returned across the room, and the warm, false mask slid smoothly back into its place. When at last Coombe showed him out, and the drum of his horse had faded once more into the reeds, the Duke let his invalid's slouch fall away like a dropped cloak, and stood straight, and his pewter eyes were very bright and very hard. "Well," he said, "my cousin came a great distance to nurse a man he expected to find nearer death than this, and he was not pleased to be disappointed. He named Marek without being asked," Verity said, "twice. And he wished you carried off to Fenwald, away from your kitchen and your still room, and into that man's care, the very care that saw your brother into the ground. He did." The Duke looked at the door his cousin had gone through, and yet, he warned me of this, in myself, and now he warned her again, in the same words she had begun to think. Bramwell is a vain and hungry fool who has spent 30 years spending an inheritance he does not have. Everything in me wishes to hang him for it tonight, but the hand that has poisoned me for a month is a patient hand, Miss Wren, a careful and studied hand, and my cousin has never in his life been patient about anything. He could pay for this. He has not the nerve to do it." He turned to her, which means either I am wrong about him or he did not act alone. The blow, when it came 3 nights later, and it did not come from Bramwell. Verity had known it was building. She had watched it gather in the Duke the whole of that day, the way she had learned to watch weather come across the flat fen before a storm, when a wrong step out of doors could cost a careless soul its life. He had grown quiet in the morning, and by the afternoon he had gone wholly silent. He flinched from the branch of candles upon the table, and had her carry them out of the room. By evening he sat with his eyes shut, and his jaw set like a man biting down upon a leather strap, and when Coombe let a door fall to somewhere far off in the house, the Duke's whole frame jerked as though he had been struck across the face. "It is the megrim," he said through his teeth. "It comes so. When the weather turns, it will pass. It always passes. Leave me." But she did not leave. She had learned, across 10 years of being ordered from rooms, exactly how much an order is worth from a person in pain, which is nothing at all, and she stayed where she was and watched him. He had risen to go up to his chamber and got no further than the desk, where his hand closed white upon the edge of it and would not let go, and a sound escaped him that he plainly hated. Low and torn out of him, the sound of a strong man being taken to pieces from the inside by a pain he had no way to fight. He bowed his dark head. Sweat stood out upon his temple and ran down through the streak of white. Verity did not ring for Coombe. Verity. She did not offer him pity, for she had learned young that pity is a slow acid, that it eats at the pride of a proud person and leaves them smaller than it found them. She simply began, quietly, to work. She had the fire in his chamber, banked low before ever he reached it, and the heavy curtains drawn against the last of the gray daylight, and the whole room made as dark and as hushed as a held breath. She had gone down to her still room in the meanwhile, and taken down only what she wholly trusted, the feverfew she had found still sound in its jar, a little of the willow bark, a spoon of honey. And she had brewed it herself, over her own small fire, from the first leaf to the last drop, letting no other hand near it. And she had tasted it herself, before ever she carried it up, because she would not ask a living soul to drink what she had not first drunk down before them. "Drink this," she said, into the dark of the chamber. He was a long shape in the great bed, one arm flung up across his eyes. "What is it?" he said. His voice had worn thin as a coin rubbed smooth. "It is feverfew and willow and a little honey, all of it grown upon this land, all of it made by my own hand and tasted from my own cup, not a minute since. It has passed through no hand but mine, from the plant to the pot to this cup." She sat upon the edge of the chair drawn close to the bed and held the cup steady in the blackness. "I know to the last leaf what is in it, because I made the whole of it, and it is the only medicine you will ever again take in this house. Now drink." There was a long silence in the dark. Then his hand came away from his eyes and searched, and found the cup, and his cold, unsteady fingers closed over hers upon it, and stayed there a moment, and he drank it down. She did not touch him beyond that, only sat, a quiet and solid presence in the dark beside him, and after a while she took a folded cloth she had wrung out in cool water and laid it across his brow, and when the first grew warm from him she changed it for another, and then another, and said nothing at all through any of it. The willow would ease the pain in time. The dark and quiet would do the rest. Her mother had always held that half of any suffering is born the easier for a body simply not being left alone inside it. Slowly, by small degrees, the terrible locked tension began to go out of him. His breathing lengthened and deepened. The clenched hand upon the coverlet loosened and lay open. And into that dark and easing quiet, at the last, he began to speak, low and unguarded, as men speak of their worst things only when they are certain they cannot be seen. "I have believed," he said, "for 3 years, that there was a rot bred into my blood, that whatever took Edmund was grown into the very bone of this family, and had come for me next in my turn, and that I was cursed to sit alone in this house, and feel it, eat me slowly, exactly as I had watched it eat him." He drew a slow breath. "They call me mad. In the villages, did you know that? The mad Duke of Blackmere." And I began, heaven help me, to more than half believe them. A man kept alone in the dark long enough will believe very nearly anything of himself. He was quiet a moment, and when he went on, his voice had dropped so low she had to lean toward him to gather it. "I sat with Edmund at the end," he said. "My brother, I held his hand while he went out of the world by inches across a whole winter, and there was nothing in all my strength or all my money that I could do but sit and watch it. And when it was over I was almost glad, may heaven forgive me for it, glad only that the long waiting was finished. And then it came for me in my turn, and I was not glad any more. I have lain awake 3 years, asking why it should take him and spare me. I have called it a curse, and I have called it black luck, and, once or twice, I have called it a punishment for surviving him, for he was the better man, by a long way, and by rights it should have been Edmund who lived." His breath caught and steadied. "You have told me tonight that it was none of those things. It was a man, with a bottle, and a purpose, and a price. I cannot yet tell whether that is easier to carry or harder, but it is the truth, and I have been 3 years starving for a little of it." Verity turned the cool cloth once more upon his brow. "You are not cursed," she said quietly. "There is no rot in your blood, and there never was. You are not mad, Your Grace, and you were never mad. You were poisoned, patiently and on purpose, by a living hand and for a living reason, and that is a wound that I know how to mend." She heard her own voice come gentle and did not check it this time. 3 years. You have grieved yourself as a dying man and named yourself cursed for the crime of living. You are not dying. You are being murdered, which is a terrible thing to be, but it is a thing with an ending, and I mean with all that I am to bring you safe to it. He was silent a long while. In the dark, she felt him turn his head upon the pillow toward her. "You came to my door," he said, "to be laughed at and turned away, and instead you have handed me back my own mind." He lifted his hand slowly, and found her wrist where it rested near his face, and he did not grip it, only laid his cold fingers along the warm pulse of it, as though to make certain of the beat. "I do not know what I am to do with you, Verity Wren," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her given name, and it came out of him rough and unpracticed, as though he had carried it about some days, and only now dared set it down between them. You are the one true thing in a house that has held nothing but lies. Her breath had gone unsteady in her chest. She did not draw her hand away. She let his cold fingers rest along the warm run of her pulse, and she felt, with a plainness that frightened her more than any poison had, the exact moment the thing between them stopped being a bargain and became something neither of them had thought to bargain for. The dark held it close. Neither of them spoke its name aloud. It was enough that night that he slept at the last, deep and easy and unafraid, and that she was there beside him, and that for the first time in 3 long years the Duke of Blackmere went down into sleep without fearing he might never come up out of it. She sat on beside him until his breathing was slow and certain. Only then, easing her hand at last from beneath his, did she let herself think ahead, cold and clear as her mother had taught her to think, to the thing that must yet come. Merrick. If the poison rode in the physician's own medicine, then Merrick was the hand upon the bottle, or the glove drawn over it. And a man who had killed 1 brother and was 3 patient years about the second would not lay his work aside, merely because a still-room woman had begun to put her nose to his cordials. He would come again. He would have to. And this time, she thought, looking down through the dark at the sleeping face of the man she had given over pretending to herself she did not love, this time it would be the 2 of them lying in wait for him. The poison, denied its road, began to lose its war. With every day that passed, the Duke came a little further back toward the land of the living. The gray went out of his skin. The megrims loosened their grip and came less often. He walked the length of the long gallery one morning without once putting his hand to the wall, and stopped at the end of it, and laughed aloud, like a man who has forgotten the very sound of his own gladness. They fell, without ever agreeing to it, into the shape of their days. Breakfast taken together in the bright dining room, the long mornings in the still room, she at her work and he on his stool. Barrow, the old hound who had refused the kitchen for a fortnight, took bread from Verity's hand within the week, and thereafter followed her from room to room, having plainly decided that whatever was happening, she was the safe end of it. She no longer flinched when the Duke came into a room. He no longer arranged his face for anyone. And neither of them spoke of the night in the dark chamber, though it lay beneath every ordinary hour like a warm coal under ash, and both of them knew it, and both of them let it be. It could not last, of course. On a still gray morning at the very end of the week, Coombe brought in the post upon his salver, and among it, in a careful clerk's hand, lay a note that made the Duke go very still. Merrick, he said, is coming tomorrow. To bring me, he writes, a stronger cordial. They did not sleep at all that night. They made ready, instead, the 2 of them and old Coombe, moving quietly through the sleeping house by a single shaded candle, and by the time the gray dawn came up cold over the reeds, every piece the Duke had gathered in secret stood in its place, and the trap, such as it was set. For the Duke had been anything but idle in the days while Verity nursed and brewed. A patient man himself, when patience served his purpose, he had sent riders out quietly across 3 counties on errands he named to no one. He had run to ground the still-room woman who had fled in the night the winter before, and won from her, for a fee and a promise of protection, a sworn account of what she had smelled beneath the honey in Merrick's cordials before her nerve broke. He had found the girl Nell gone to earth at an aunt's cottage on the far shore of the fen, half out of her wits with fright, and had learned from her, gently, the thing that turned the whole matter into the light. It was Merrick who met her upon the dark stair every night this month. Merrick who took the covered tray from her hands for the space of a breath upon the landing, his back turned to her, and gave it back again. Merrick who had pressed a coin into her palm and told her it was physic, no concern of a kitchen girl's, and that she would do well to forget it. And the Duke had sent, last of all and most quietly of all, for Sir Hollis Pike, the magistrate of the district, a hard, honest, close-mouthed old man who had known and respected the Duke's father, and who now sat concealed in the small book-room that opened off the library. Its connecting door left the width of a hand ajar. 2 constables silent at his back, and a clerk at his elbow with a freshly sharpened pen. Dr. Merrick came at noon, as his careful note had promised he would. He was a lean and unhurried man, gray as a January afternoon, with a soft, level voice, clean, careful hands, and the settled manner of a man long accustomed to being the cleverest head in any room. He set his black bag down upon the desk, with the small sigh of a busy man, much put upon. He asked after the Duke's symptoms in a low, sympathetic murmur, clicking his tongue over each answer, and drew out at last a fresh, stoppered bottle of something dark and syrupy, poured a careful measure into a glass, and warmed it at the library fire with his own 2 hands, unhurried and certain of his ground. "A stronger draught," he said, turning and holding it out to the Duke. "You are much reduced since last I saw you, your Grace, much reduced, and it grieves me to see it. We must build your strength against the season, or I very much fear we shall lose you before ever the spring comes in." Verity stepped forward from the corner where she had stood all the while unregarded, as women and servants are so easily left unregarded. She reached out and took the warmed glass from the physician's hand before ever the Duke could close his own around it. "I keep his Grace's cordials now, Doctor," she said, pleasant and mild as new milk. "I will taste it through first, as I taste everything that passes his lips." She raised it, drew its scent slowly in, let her face settle, and set the glass down again with great care. "Bitter almonds," she said, into the dead silence of the room. "Under all that treacle the very same as the last one, and as every one that came before it." She lifted her eyes to his gray ones. "You have grown careless, sir. Or else it never once crossed your mind that a healer's trained nose would be let through the doors of this house again. You took a great deal of quiet trouble 3 years ago to see that it would not." For a single unguarded instant, the settled cleverness cracked clean across the gray face, and beneath it, Verity saw plainly the thing that had patiently killed 2 brothers, cold and swift and wholly without warmth, a mind doing its sums even now. Then the crack sealed over, and the soft voice came again, smooth and grieved and reasonable. "The woman is deranged, your Grace," he said, gathering his dignity about him like a dry coat. "Almonds. It is a strengthening syrup, and nothing else, compounded by my own hand these 3 years. If your Grace has come to prefer the physicking of a nameless vagrant off the fen road to that of the man who sat at his own brother's deathbed and eased his passing, then I fear there is little more that you eased him into his grave," said the Duke. He rose as he said it, and he did not stoop now, and he did not let his step drag, and Dr. Merrick's soft words dried in his mouth as he watched the dying man draw up to his full straight height and understood, in one cold falling instant, that the Duke of Blackmere had not been dying at all for above a week, and had walked into a room made ready for his coming. "Sir Hollis," the Duke said, and did not raise his voice, "will you be so good as to come in now?" The old magistrate came through from the book-room with his 2 constables at his heels, and his clerk behind them, and the gray drained out of Merrick's face until it was the color of cold tallow. What followed was quick, and quiet, and orderly, which Verity thought a mercy, and also, somehow, worse than any shouting would have been. The sworn statement of the still-room woman read out into the room. The sworn word of the girl Nell who would stand up before the assize and tell how this man had met her nightly upon the stair. The dark bottle from his own bag and the warmed glass upon the desk both sealed under the magistrate's hand, to be carried to an honest apothecary and proven for what they were. Merrick stood through the whole of it without moving, and when at the end of it he saw that there was no road left open anywhere, he did the last cold sum of his long calculating life, and chose to speak, not to save himself, for he was far too clever to imagine that he could, but to be certain that he did not fall alone. "I am a servant," he said very low and very precise, "no more than a paid servant, in this. Every drop that I ever poured was ordered, and every drop was paid for by the man who stands to gain the whole of it by these deaths, and who has been standing out upon that causeway since first light this morning, waiting for the word that it was done." The library door swung open. Bramwell Vaughan had not, in the end, been able to keep himself away. He had ridden out at dawn and lurked among the reeds along the causeway, and now, catching the sound of his physician's voice running on too long and too loud through the door, he had come in at the last to see for himself, and had walked directly into the wreck of everything he had spent 30 years contriving. He tried, at the very last, the only weapon a man of his making ever truly carries. He tried a story. He knew nothing whatever of any poison. He was horrified. He was betrayed. He was as cruelly deceived as his poor cousin by a physician the whole family had trusted. And when that found no purchase upon a single face turned toward him in that cold room, the charm slid off him all at once and altogether, and what was left standing there in the fine silver waistcoat he had never been able to pay for was only a frightened, hunted, wholly ruined man. The creditors held his name in every counting-house from York down to London. Fenwold was mortgaged to the very slates upon its roof. He had spent the whole of his life borrowing against a dukedom that stubbornly would not fall to him, and the borrowing had at long last run dry, and there had been nothing left in the world to do but make the dukedom fall. "And Verity," said the Duke, very softly, watching his cousin the way a man watches a diseased creature dragged at last out into the daylight. "Tell me now about the woman you arranged to have sent to my door." For that had been the final piece of it, and the Duke had laid it whole into Verity's hands, only that dawn. Bramwell, drowning in his own debts, had gone to another soul drowning in the very same black waters, a widow named Ottiline Wren, who owed money in every place that he did, and had struck his bargain with her. She was to send her unwanted stepdaughter out to Blackmere, got up as a healer, timed to arrive upon the very night the long work was to be finished, so that when the mad recluse of the fens was found at last dead of his lingering illness, there would be, conveniently to hand, a strange woman in the house, versed in herbs and still-room craft, a nobody with no family living to speak a word in her defense, ready-made to hang for it. Ottiline would be quit of a hated burden and forgiven a crushing debt at a single stroke. Bramwell would have his coronet and his scapegoat both. In the one night they chose their scapegoat very poorly, the Duke said. They wanted a nobody who knew just enough of herbs to be plausibly blamed for them. What they got instead was a healer who knew enough of them to catch you. He looked at Verity down the length of the ruined library, and for once his hard face held nothing back at all. "The one cruelty your stepmother could not deny herself," he said, "even in the very middle of a murder, was the pleasure of sending the one soul beneath her roof that she truly despised. And so she sent me, out of nothing but spite, The only woman in all of England who could possibly have saved my life. Sir Hollis Pike rose and squared his papers and gave the quiet word to his constables. They took the physician and the heir away between them, the one grey and silent, and already gone somewhere far behind his own eyes, the other weeping and protesting and calling upon the name of every soul he had ever wronged, the whole long way down the drive, until the patient marsh at last folded the sound of him over and away into nothing. And Blackmere Hall was quiet once more, and clean. The house, in the days that followed, was very still, the way the air is still after a long fever has finally broken. The danger was gone. And with it gone, a new and quieter fear crept into Verity in the small hours. One she was too honest to pretend away. She found the Duke in the library on the third evening at the window, watching the last light die red over the water. She made herself say it plainly, as she said everything. "Your Grace," she said, "you hired me to keep you alive, and to find the hand that meant to kill you. It is found. You are well. The thing you paid me for is done." She kept her voice level, the way she had kept it level through 10 years of expecting nothing. "I have no family now. My name is worth less than it ever was, for the whole county believes I am the stranger the mad Duke took in, and they will not trouble to imagine anything virtuous. I have £30 and a great debt of gratitude, and gratitude is a poor foundation on which to build a life. I have seen what becomes of women kept on, because it would be awkward to be rid of them. I would not be that in your house. I would rather know the worst of it now and plainly, than come slowly to understand it over years. So I would rather ask you honestly than wonder, what am I now in this house? Am I to stay a servant kept on out of kindness? Because I have been kept out of kindness before, and I would sooner walk the causeway on foot, like the last one, than be a charity you cannot bring yourself to turn out." The Duke was quiet a moment. Then, to her surprise, he did not answer her at all. He crossed to the side table where a cup stood covered, one she had made up for him earlier, and left to cool. And he took off the cloth, and he lifted it. She was across the room before she knew she had moved. "Do not," she said, sharp with an old habit of fear. "You do not know whose hands. I know whose hands," said the Duke, and stopped, and looked at her over the rim of the cup exactly as he had looked at her on the first night, when a different cup had hung between them and a stranger's voice had rung out to stop him. Only everything was turned around now. "Yours," he said. "I know it was made by yours." And he drank it down, every drop, without hesitation, watching her the whole while, and set the empty cup upon the table. "For 3 years," he said, "I have not swallowed a mouthful in this house without wondering if it was the one that would kill me. I have trusted no cup, no dish, no hand, not my cook, not my butler, not my own blood. And here I stand and drink whatever you put before me, and do not think twice, because you are the one person on this earth I am certain means me to live." He came toward her. "That is not gratitude, Verity. I have been shown gratitude, and paid it, and forgotten it by morning. This is not that, and I think you know it is not, and I think it frightens you as much as it frightens me, which is a great deal. I did not ask you to drink it to prove a point," she said unsteadily. "I did not drink it to prove a point. I drank it because it is the only vow I have that is worth anything." He stood before her now. "A man like me has no pretty words, and would not trust them if he had. But I can hand you my life in a cup every day for the rest of it, and know it is safe, and that is the nearest thing to worship I have in me." He took her ink and herb-stained hands in his. "Stay. Not as a servant, and not as a charity, and not because you have nowhere else. Marry me. Be mistress of this house that you have already given back its master. Let the county say what it likes. They cannot touch the Duchess of Blackmere, and they will have to say it to your face and bow while they do. You swore, she managed, that you would never let anyone close enough to be lost again. I did. And then a woman I had never met stood in my study and shouted at me not to die. He almost smiled. I find my oaths were not built for you. Say yes, Verity. I have been 3 years learning that I am not cursed. Do not make me spend 3 more learning to sleep again without you in the house. Verity looked at this hard, guarded, ruined, mending man who had drunk from her hand to tell her a thing he had no words for, and she found that the endurance she had counterfeited for 10 years had finally, quietly, turned into something real. Yes, she said, and then, quieter, a word she had never once let herself use aloud. Yes, Gideon. She saw it land, saw the proud, unbending man take his own name from her mouth as though she had handed him something he had long ago stopped hoping to be given. And then, because she was herself, and because he would have thought her replaced by a stranger otherwise, I will want the still room put right properly. New shelves. It is a disgrace, and I will not answer for your cordials until it is mended. The Duke of Blackmere threw back his head and laughed, the full sound of it ringing up into the cold rafters of the old house, startling Barrow awake by the fire. Anything, he said. Anything at all. Only stay. They were married 3 weeks later, not in any great cathedral with the whole ton craning to watch, but in the small stone church at the edge of the Blackmere land, where the marsh birds cried over the reeds, and the fen wind found every gap in the old walls. Verity did not wear the white of a girl. She wore a gown of deep marsh green, the color of the water under the willows, sent up from the county town, and it was not the gown of a discarded stepdaughter or a servant kept out of pity. It was the gown of a woman who had walked into a house of death and made it a house of the living. There were no lords to see it. Coombe stood as witness, and wept without shame, into a square of linen he had pressed for the occasion, and Mrs. Mashyn. Fenwick sobbed into another, and even old Barrow was there, lying across the cold flags by the door as though he meant to guard this too. When the vicar spoke the words that bound them, the Duke did not offer his new wife the polite, cool kiss the occasion allowed. He drew her in against him there in the freezing little church, and kissed her as though he were a man coming up out of deep water into air, and she held to him, and for neither of them was there anywhere else in the world they needed to be. The news reached London a week on, and it was not received as a scandal, it was received as a thunderclap. The mad recluse of the fens, it transpired, had never been mad at all, but poisoned these 3 years, by his own heir and his own physician, both now awaiting the assize in the county jail. And the ruined stranger, the county, had been so ready to pity and despise, had turned out to be the one who caught them, and had walked out of that dark house, not disgraced, but a duchess. Bramwell Vaughan would trouble no one further, his debts and his crimes having at last caught up with him in the same season. And as for Lady Ottoline Wren, whose part in it all came out in the telling, she found the county doors that had opened so readily to her now shut in her face. Her credit stopped, her daughters unasked to any table that mattered, and she removed at last to a small, cold set of rooms in a town where no one knew her. Verity thought, when word of it reached her, a punishment far better fitted to the crime than any rope, for Ottoline Wren had always feared obscurity a great deal more than she had ever feared God, and now she would have the whole of her remaining years to sit alone in it, Spring came slow to the fen, and then all at once the black water turning silver, the reeds greening, the willows letting down their new hair over the causeway where a hired coach had once carried a frightened woman toward what was meant to be her ruin. The still room of Blackmere was scrubbed and shelved and stocked, and it smelled once more of drying lavender and warm beeswax, the way another still room had smelled a long time ago, in the good years, before everything. On a bright morning in April, Verity carried a cup of elderflower cordial into the library, made by her own hand as everything he drank was made by her own hand now, and set it at her husband's elbow where he sat over the estate books. He picked it up without looking, and without a flicker of doubt, and drank. She stood a moment watching him. This man who once would not have touched a cup in his own house for all the gold in England, and who now drank whatever she gave him as easily. As breathing, she thought of the rain and the 4 shillings, no, the 7, sewn into a thin cloak. She thought of a glass of poison steaming on a desk, and her own voice ringing out unbidden to stop a stranger from dying. It had been meant as the cruelest of jokes, that journey across the fen, a woman sent to be blamed for a murder, and instead, here she stood, in the warm and living heart of the house, watching him drink from her hand without fear. He looked up and caught her watching, and the last hard line eased from his face into something that, 3 years before, no one living would have believed the Duke of Blackmere still capable of. "You are staring, Your Grace," he said. "Someone must," said Verity, and took up the cup and finished the last of it herself. And I find I no longer mind how it ends. If Verity and her guarded Duke found their way into your heart, and you cheered to see 2 patient poisoners undone by the one woman they underestimated, then stay with us a while. Nothing is so satisfying as a quiet, clever heroine who walks into the lion's den and walks out its mistress. If you love this tale of a haunted recluse and a fearless healer, tap the like button, which helps the channel grow. Share it with anyone who treasures a brave heart and a slow, tender romance. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next story. Tell us your favorite moment in the comments below.